Well, a warm welcome to this talk, and always a pleasure to welcome back James Roguski from California. James, thank you so much for coming back.
Thanks for having me. A lot of news to report, so I appreciate the opportunity.
Now, I know you're one of the busiest people in the world at the moment, so we really appreciate what you're doing. Exposing misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, and we'll be putting the links to James' Substack and everything that is there. Now, the first question, we're talking about this World Health Organization, the pandemic treaty and international health regulations. Now, you've been studying this for some time. Is it all a fairly open process that's being taken at a leisurely pace, or is there secrecy? Isn't it being rushed? Do you have all the documents you need, or do you have difficulty obtaining the documents that you need?
Oh, the answer is obvious, the secrecy and the lack of, openness. But I actually want to add a third thing, or rather a fourth thing to the mis, dis, and malinformation. There's also the idea of old information. And so, John, I'm going to maybe embarrass you a little bit. We didn't talk about this in advance. I want to sing your praises because amongst the many things that you should be praised for, one of the things that you've exhibited is the ability to work through cognitive dissonance and any kind of confirmation bias. We all have the information that we think we've learned something, and it's one of the hardest things in the world to do is to unlearn or set aside or push back on old information when new information comes in that conflicts with what you thought you knew. Um, you know, Praise you. You've exhibited the ability to go, oh, wait a minute. This new information causes me to be required to reevaluate what I thought I knew. And that's what I hope to bring to light today. The WHO has done a really good job of getting a lot of people to bark up the wrong tree. And if I can paint a mental picture, just give me a minute. If you can look out the window in your yard, okay, I've seen your window there. If you could imagine having a dog in your backyard, and he sees a squirrel, and he chases that squirrel up a tree, and he's barking up the tree, but you notice that the squirrel bounced from treetop to treetop to treetop and is long gone, and the dog is still barking up the wrong tree. Okay, now take that idea and combine it with, in any negotiation, a wise negotiator, a savvy negotiator, isn't going to just ask for the least thing that they're ever going to want. They put a lot of red herrings out there. They go, oh, well, we want the sun and the moon and the stars in the sky. And then when it gets tough in the negotiations, they say, well, yeah, okay, I'll give you that, but you got to give me this, that, and the other thing. And ultimately, they want to walk away with what they really wanted. And so what has happened with these negotiations is, in half of them, they keep coming up with new things, but they don't show us certain details. And in the amendments, the information that we're allowed to see is more than a year old, and it had a lot of crazy stuff in it. And that crazy stuff, we need to realize that much of it has been gone for a year, but they haven't let us see it. So I got lucky a little more than 4 weeks ago. They had said that a new version of the pandemic treaty was going to be released on March 8th to the inner circle, right? They ultimately released it publicly on March 13th. But I went looking for it, and I stumbled upon a leaked version of the amendments to the international health regulations, which for me was like the holy grail. It's like they've been keeping this secret for a year. And that's one of the things I hope to talk about, in that it's all fluid, it's all changing. So you can't take anything as being rock solid, trustworthy, set in stone, or anything like that. But we need to pay attention to this new leaked information and make sure that we're pushing back on, the latest version of whatever it is. Now, with the amendments, they missed their deadline already. So on one level, we're just having a fun conversation about a moot point. They should not be allowed to have anything, to agree on anything in May because their deadline has long passed.
But that doesn't really bother people like this, does it? They just sort of carry on as if the rules don't apply to them.
You're absolutely right. In 2022, there's a perfect living example of it. On May 24th, 2022, at the 75th World Health Assembly, the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, in crystal clear violation of Article 55, submitted five amendments to five articles in the middle of the assembly. They certainly did not give 4 months' notice. And 4 days later, and I'm pretty sure we've talked about this, but nobody's really picking up on it. They put forth a document on May 28th, 2022. My apologies. May 28th, 2022. They put forth an official document stating that those amendments to five articles were adopted. There's just one little problem, John. They didn't have a vote. They didn't need, it's not like in the United States where you have an election and how you count the votes is one thing. They didn't even bother to have a vote. They just said it was adopted. Now, Rob Roos from the Netherlands and 11 other members of the European Parliament on November 28th, 2023, 18 months to the day afterwards, sent a letter to Tedros and said, where's the proof that there was ever a vote? And without that vote, these amendments are null and void. Well, 3 days ago, the WHO World Health Assembly for the 77th Assembly in May, they're starting to upload documents. They uploaded a document 3 days ago that stated that those five amendments will be entering into legally binding force on May 31st, 2024. And they also mentioned that the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Slovakia, and New Zealand have rejected them. Well, good on those countries for paying attention. How about the other 192 that should be standing up and calling out voting fraud? Well, if they could do that so blatantly, right, and then just ignore their 4 month notice deadline and continue these negotiations and have the treaty be tied integrally, synergistically with an illegitimate document. You're right, John. What stops them other than public outrage in terms of the fraudulent nature of this entire operation?
And governments didn't seem to notice. Governments, for example, I don't know, countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. It just begs credulity that they will carry on with this, and the fact that it's changing all the time, almost like a mutating virus, James. Virus might be a good term, that keeps changing. How do governments know what they're signing up to? Are the negotiators completely on the ball with this? Is all the information released to them? Because it's not really released to the hoi polloi like you and me. Do you think the government negotiators are fully up to date?
Well, the negotiators are somewhat up to date, but there's a difficulty with all of this because the negotiations are primarily done in English. The WHO supports 6 languages, and they have translation for Spanish and Russian and Chinese and Arabic and French and English. But every other nation, with any other primary language, is left to their own devices to try to, find a translation. And universally, they do it in English, and all of the other languages lag behind. And one of the other issues, and I published an open letter to the WHO a couple of days ago, not written by me, I republished it. It was written by David Bell and Sylvia Berendt and others, who raised the issue again that is raised by many of the smaller nations, what they are doing is they're having a lot of meetings, and they're having parallel meetings, informal meetings. And nations like the United States, or maybe the United Kingdom or China, might have dozens or even more in their delegation. But a lot of the smaller nations only send one or two people. And so they're cut out of much of the negotiations. So while I really want to get into the details with you, and I know that your audience, appreciates the fact that you do that,
They do.
the bigger high picture, viewpoint is what's with the secrecy? It's not like we're negotiating the release of a hostage and it's a life and death situation, so you want to do that quietly. This is, the health of everyone in the world. Don't you think, we ought to have an open door policy to see what's going on? So the secrecy
And
is
what's
on.
the rush? What's the urgency? Why are they just trying to ram this through, really quickly? It's
Well, the longer it goes, the more we see what they're up to, and the more time there is for us to figure out that we don't want what they're doing. And so the the core premise, though, I want to get to the core premise, because
mm,
all of this is a lot of smoke and mirrors, right? A bunch of red herrings and straw man arguments and all these many things. When you bring it down to the core, the reason why these negotiations were called for by the relatively poor nations of the world back on December 1st, 2021, is they were upset that they were not getting equitable access to pandemic related products. Well, you and your audience, and millions of people around the world would look at them going, you should fall down on your knees and thank your lucky stars that you missed out on all these wonderful mRNA high technology injectables, not to mention the run death is near and everything else that's out there. And so, what is the premise underneath these negotiations is that the poorer nations were not treated fairly in terms of the distribution of biological weapons. And what they're saying is they want geographically distributed manufacture of mRNA vaccines, and the investment from the global north to build out the pharmaceutical hospital emergency industrial complex infrastructure so that they can profit from the next time something like this happens. They can isolate their, whatever pathogen they may find, spend billions of dollars looking for pathogens with pandemic potential, bring them into the WHO coordinated laboratory network. Then, now this is kind of really the sticking point. This is the reason why these negotiations are happening. If you could recall back to the time when South Africa and Botswana, and there were a couple of other nations as well, identified Omicron, totally different variant. They were above board as soon as they found out. They made it very, very public, as they thought they were obligated to do under the international health regulations. Well, they were not supposed to be greeted with travel restrictions. That's like a gentleman's agreement in the IHR that nations are not supposed to punish other nations when they're transparent. But the kick in the pants for them really was then Pfizer and Moderna took that genetic information, ultimately worked it into the boosters, made a couple of more $1 billion, and they're saying, hey, wait a minute, we gave you access to pathogens. Where's the benefit sharing? Well, the language that's currently in the document, and if you read the latest changes, the United States primarily, and many other countries, in my opinion, you could have an interpretation of these changes as you wish, they're shilling for big pharma. They don't want to share the profits. They want to demand that all the nations in the world immediately hand over their pathogen information, but it's really fuzzy language in terms of transparency coming from the pharmaceutical companies, openness about contracts. They still want liability protection. Essentially, what we have, in my opinion, is a fascist organization, government working with big industry, not to help make people healthier, but essentially to protect profits and market share. So I've dubbed the
Give us the
treaty.
information and we'll make the money. Just give us the information.
I've dubbed what's going on with the treaty the new OPEC. Now, OPEC is the oil producing and exporting countries, but this is really an organization of pandemic emergency corporations looking looking for pathogens, bringing them into a laboratory, maybe manipulating them, turning them into money-making drugs and jabs, speeding up the regulatory approval process, putting that in the hands of the WHO. They charge tens of thousands of dollars for their authorizations or approvals or pre-approval, pre-qualification, whatever they want to call it, but then also putting the WHO in charge of a global distribution and logistics network just screams organized crime. This isn't how you stop the next pandemic. It's how we got into the last one, and it's how they would profit from this network that they're trying to build.
And I suspect if they look really hard for organisms with pandemic potential, you know what? They might find some
Well, most times,
or make some.
most times pathogens are found in excrement. And if you go back to, before World War One, before there were automobiles and people rode horses and they lived on farms and they didn't have indoor plumbing and sewage and septic systems, there was excrement all over the place. Must have been pretty gross. And so the original agreements for sanitary regulations around the world made a lot of sense. When cars replaced horses and indoor plumbing was installed, and people, stopped living downstream from, an area where they would just dump sewage straight into the water, where it was treated and processed, all the disease rates fell precipitously. By the time the WHO showed up on the scene, most childhood infectious diseases and infectious diseases across the board were gone because of sanitation. And there's still much to be done. Not every nation in the world has that all fixed up. But I've spoken to people in the UK who have told me that the 100-year-old sewage systems get overloaded, and wastewater ends up in the mussel and clam shells and oyster shell beds. And so there's always an E. coli outbreak and whatever it might be. So there's still work to be done to clean up and have more sanitary conditions. But they're turning this on its head. Rather than go and see where these unsanitary conditions may still be, they want to go in, get the pathogens from, your chicken coop or your pigsty or your cow barn or horse, stables, or, your local bat cave or pangolin enclosure or whatever it might be. Bring that into the lab so they can scare the bejeebers out of people, turn it into a product. Now, here's the point, John, behind all of this, and it's easily skipped over. You've been, talking about it for years now. Excuse me, WHO, the jabs don't work. They don't stop infection. They don't stop transmission. They derange your immune system. They cause disease, disability, death, both excess and sudden. And the diagnostics are a joke. I got a notice from the WHO about a week ago in their, not me personally, but they put out their news media thing. And there was a suspected outbreak of cholera in the East African nation of Malawi. Now, you're skilled, John. You would probably have some ideas about what they might do to prevent cholera and what they might do to help people who are suffering from it, various protocols. What did they do? They sent 1.4 million tests. So my bad joke about this is, well, there's probably almost 8 billion undetected asymptomatic cases of cholera in the world. We need to spend money on tests. Now, you're more knowledgeable about this than I am. I'm going to guess that if somebody has cholera, they know it. They don't need to take a test to let them know that they're suffering from that ailment. And if it's
It
something that
just
is,
runs out if you like water, James. It just runs out.
well,
Become dehydrated sometimes within hours.
diarrhea is a genetic disease, right? You've heard that. It runs in your genes. And so
Yeah.
they should be treating, this properly rather than just moving money around by ordering more tests. Well, if 1.4 million cholera tests go to Malawi, somebody's getting a contract to replace those tests. And this is really what we're dealing with. Now, we can go anywhere with this conversation. There's an awful lot of things that are in the details of the documents, and I want people to understand some very important aspects of it because the story at the beginning, a year ago, they got us to chase a squirrel up a tree. And the rug has been pulled out from that. And what we have been allowed to see with the amendments is long dead. The originally submitted amendments, what happened was they were submitted in September 30th of 2022. They kept them secret until mid-December. I found them. I started, talking about them. I did a whole movie at the beginning of January 2023. But then what happened is through October, November, December, and then January of 2023, Tedros had assigned a panel of 20 experts called the International Health Regulations Review Committee. They reported to Tedros in mid-January, and then on February 6th of 2023, more than a year ago, they published a final report. And when I first read it, I was quite frankly surprised because I agreed with a lot of the things that were in the report. Not necessarily everything, but a lot of it. They said some things like, hey, you really can't cross out dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. You probably got to leave that alone, right? And, through the rumor mills, I spoke to someone in India, because that's where that came from. They said, oh, India retracted that quite some time ago. That was a misunderstanding. Yeah, okay, fine. Here's where the big problem is, and we still don't have a concrete official answer because they won't release any official new document. The problem really came from Bangladesh. Bangladesh proposed a new Article 13A, and so did the African nations. Two separate submitted documents, but very, very similar. And so what they wanted is they wanted to set up the Director General as the dictator of the distribution and logistics for pandemic-related products, not to control what your doctor does with you, not to control your choices, but to control the movement of pandemic-related products. Article 13A seeks or sought, we don't know yet, to set up an allocation mechanism so that if Tedros decides that there's a public health emergency of international concern, a fake, according to their proposed amendments to Article 13A, he would be able to tell Nation A that they had to manufacture whatever he said and that they would have to give it to whatever nation needed it. In order to facilitate that, Bangladesh proposed the amendment to the definition of a temporary or a standing recommendation and crossed out non-binding. Well, if recommendations are non-binding and other areas of the amendments said nations have to do this and have to follow this recommendation and so forth and so on, well, that opened up the specter of, my goodness, he's the dictator of health for the whole world. Well, the International Health Regulations Review Committee on February 6, 2023, kind of put the kibosh on that. They said, if recommendations suddenly become orders, that would change the whole nature of what's going on, and it would actually bring down the possibility of liability, and the Director General would, even more than he does now, have a bullseye on his back, being blamed for giving orders that caused problems. So the WHO doesn't want to be in that position. And this is what people have neglected to enter into their thinking. The nations who wanted Tedros to be in charge of distribution, you get some vaccines, and like Oprah Winfrey, everybody gets vaccines, right? They don't really want that, but the nations came up with that idea in order to try to get the wealthier nations to not hog up all the jabs. Canada ordered 400 million jabs for 40 million people, and South Africa, who handed over the Omicron variant, genetic information, had a hard time, getting. They're lucky. They should be counting their blessings that they didn't get the jabs that they wanted. But the manner in which products were distributed clearly followed the money. If a nation could just print money and give it to Pfizer, then Pfizer had plenty of product for it. If a nation couldn't afford top dollar and they wouldn't give up their military bases and embassies and liability and all those other things, they couldn't get anything. Now, it's all completely absurd because it's predicated on the idea that these biological weapons are safe and effective, and they're not. And the diagnostics have how many, what percentage of false positives that people are asymptomatic sufferers of some unknown whatever? Is it reasonable to do one PCR test on a dead chicken and then say you have to kill millions of them? The absurdity that is presented as science is what we need to be talking about. All of the many talks that you've had over the last 3-4 years is getting lost in this rush to sign some document to throw money at big pharma to pay for local manufacture of products that harm people. What in the world are they thinking? We need to call for an end to these negotiations because the premise is just completely and totally flawed. Why are they negotiating to have an expansion of the production of products that harm people? It's insane.
And I think there's been a sort of a new amendment that's introduced the idea of quarantine. What do they mean by quarantine, do you think?
Well, this is going to take up about 10 minutes, okay? Because this is a deep
Please
issue.
do it. Yeah.
I encourage people to read the existing International Health Regulations, Article 31. Article 31, in my view, needs to be, if not eliminated, certainly serious constraints need to be put on it. Now, again, this is not the WHO having some mandate that everybody has to quarantine people. That's not how this works. This is an agreement amongst all of the member nations, and this is from 2005. It says in there that nations can compel international travelers who are trying to enter their country, not within your country, but you've gone on holiday and you've gone to some other country and you're going through customs or whatever the process might be. It says in Article 31 that nations can compel travelers to have invasive medical examinations, prophylaxis, vaccine, isolation, or quarantine. Now, the first couple of parts of that are an absolute violation of bodily autonomy. It would override any kind of what I call informed dissent. You're not obligated to consent just because you're informed. You have every right to dissent, even if you are informed. Now, that is in the existing IHR. What they have added secretly, because it's not in the original proposals from 2022, is adding in Article 24 the ability to isolate or quarantine travelers as appropriate. Well, that's a little bit disturbing because, who gets to decide? There is no definition for as appropriate. Now, almost everybody I've talked to has a normal human, regular language understanding of the word isolation and the word quarantine. Most people think that isolation is something that Greta Garbo did, right? Just leave me alone. I just want to be alone. You go hide in your room and just don't want to deal with the world. And quarantine is when somebody puts you in a room and the lock is on the outside of the door, right? And something's going on. Well, the actual definition of isolation and quarantine in the IHR is kind of sort of backwards. Isolation applies to people who are ill. Quarantine applies to people who are suspect. That's literally a word that is defined in the IHR. If there was say you were on a cruise going somewhere, and someone on the cruise ship was sick, someone on the cruise ship didn't pass a rapid antigen test or some such thing, or maybe there was some package or some powder was found and everybody walked through it and it was suspect that it could be some kind of contaminant. It includes not just pathogens, but also includes contaminants. They could quarantine the entire vessel as appropriate. Now, this is a sticky question because what if there was a problem? You wouldn't want people, walking through some kind of radioactive powder and then going on their, day trip throughout the land. But you can't just leave it open to as appropriate. You could just lock down everything. And so here's where the trick really gets tricky. By putting up originally things that appeared to be a violation of our individual freedoms, many people are arguing that we need to protect national sovereignty. And almost all of the parliamentarians are saying, oh, we would never allow anything to infringe upon our national sovereignty. Well, the neat trick is that they're trying to pull is by making the ability for nations to quarantine foreign citizens who are traveling. That is actually an expression of national sovereignty. If you look at the United States, our southern border is wide open. That's pretty well known. A lot of people are trying to lock that down, and they would have people quarantined and jabbed and, oh, don't let those dirty foreigners come across the border. Well, maybe you believe that until you're the dirty foreigner when you go on holiday. And when you leave, wherever you may reside, I'll use the United States as an example. And unfortunately, there's been a lot of press about a Senate Bill 133 in Louisiana. Still hasn't gone through their assembly or been signed into law, but it says that the WHO does not have any jurisdiction in Louisiana. Well, that's great, but that's already the case. They have no jurisdiction, really, period. And so the problem is any state or national law that would say the WHO doesn't have any jurisdiction is not going to help you when you're on an airplane at the Paris airport and Macron's government says, oh, use whatever decision you want to make as appropriate to quarantine anybody who hasn't gotten jabbed, hasn't passed a test, hasn't done whatever it is that the French officials require. And so this trick that they're trying to play to get everybody standing up for national sovereignty, when all of those things were put away back in February of 23, when they read the International Health Regulations final report, many of us, saw that and realized that we need to get access to the current document so that we can approach this with clarity. Now, 4 weeks ago, I published the latest available leaked version of the amendments. And last week, I published the latest available version of the new treaty. And a year ago, our Ambassador Hamamoto agreed with the Chinese delegate that they wanted to keep secret what each nation had proposed. Well, we finally get to see what each nation is asking for in the latest available versions. And it becomes very obvious, at least for the United States, they're in support of big pharma. They want, not they don't want contracts to be transparent. They don't want liability to be upon the pharmaceutical companies. They, want to protect their profitability. And I just can't repeat it enough. Over this entire thing, the entire premise of these negotiations is predicated on ignoring all of the type of work that you've been doing for the last 3 or 4 years. Don't question the jabs. Don't question the diagnostics. Don't question distributed, independent thought around the world. Put it all under one centralized control and take billions of dollars and pump it into the big pharma solution that is no solution at all. And so these negotiations just simply need to be stopped immediately.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we've got some specific examples, James. So that you've published what we call the top 10 issues that are unacceptable in the proposed amendments to the international health regulations. And the first one you've said unacceptable is 3 levels of fear mongering. What did you mean by fear mongering?
Well, many people who pay attention to what you're doing probably understand that Tedros Ghebreyesus, the Director General, already has the unrestricted ability to declare a public health emergency of international concern. He overrode his advisory board about monkeypox and declared a fake, anyways, public health emergency of international concern, or fake. They want to add an early action alert, which, I don't know how something can be have less criteria than no criteria. A fake really doesn't have any criteria, but they want to have a more easily declared early action alert that there would be no restrictions. He could just say so. I call that the pre-fake. And then they don't want to define a pandemic, but they are trying to define a pandemic emergency. So I call that a post-fake. They want to have him be able to declare this continuum of emergencies. Well, there's a lot of people who are looking at the data now and saying, wait a minute, there really wasn't ever an emergency. There was a lot of fear mongering due to PCR. I refuse to call them a test, fraudulent use of the PCR process to scare the bejeebers out of people into thinking, oh, everybody walking around is sick and could be contagious, even though they're asymptomatic, right? Because the
Could
test
be infecting the grandmother.
Because the test says so, okay, and so allowing the Director General to utilize that authority to say there's an emergency here and an early action alert is needed there, and we've got this, that, and the other thing going on around all over the world, feeds into the business model of, if you're busy handing out contracts to distribute pandemic-related products to the WHO's global distribution and logistics network, you've got to move your product. How are you going to continue to make money if you don't use the products that you put into storage? They proudly proclaim that they have a 20,000 square meter distribution hub in Dubai, just one of the 6 regions. Well, that's 4 football fields. Can you imagine the corruption that would ensue if, the framework convention and the conference of the parties met every year to decide how to divvy up $30 billion? What is going on here is a corrupt, the creation of a corrupt organization, an organized crime syndicate, a cartel, to be able to look for pathogens, and I call them pathogens with pandemic profiteering potential, because this is the new gold rush. Yes, you could drill for oil and gas or look for gold and diamonds, but if you were to be able to identify the next scary genetic sequence and put that into the rumor mill in the major media and the propaganda machine, and have everybody believe in disease X, it's going to get you. The boogeyman is right around the corner. Take this drug or use this jab or lock everything down or whatever it might be. They think that we're stupid. They think that we haven't seen through the facade. And in the smaller nations, they missed out on the profit. It all went to Pfizer, Moderna, and so forth. They are arguing over intellectual property and manufacturing know-how, and they want investment from the global north to go to the developing nations to build laboratories and genetic sequencing laboratories and testing and manufacturing plants to make more mRNA jabs, because they think that we're going to fall for the story that more of these biological weapons are what the world needs. Well, if you have a outbreak of cholera, maybe you have a water pollution problem. Maybe you have. It would be better to spend those billions of dollars getting good, clean water and good, healthy food and nutrition and generalized care. Why are you diverting billions of dollars into jabs and drugs for a mysterious pathogen that you're looking for? This is a plan to build out the market sector that they find to be inordinately profitable.
And it's the opposite of what we want to do in healthcare. What we want to do is improve the local conditions using local technologies to get rid of the fundamental causes, as you say, the poor sanitation, facilitating local expertise to do that rather than imposing this high-tech external hegemony of interventions.
Your business school professor might look at that and say, well, that makes sense from a social standpoint, but from a financial standpoint, it's nowhere near as profitable to the people who are selling drugs and jabs.
Yep. So quarantine we've already covered. That was the second one. The third one is documents required for travel, requiring additional health documents such as test certificates, presumably vaccination certificates as well for people. Almost like the World Health Organization can control who travels and who doesn't.
I'll tweak that language just a little tiny bit. Okay, it would be up to the nations to make that actual decision, in defense of their national sovereignty. But in Annex 6, what popped up in the new documents is the WHO wants to be the universal decider of which injectable, I hesitate to call them vaccines, that's the word they use, are approved, either pre-qualified or approved for emergency use. Well, they charge a hefty fee to get listed as something that would be acceptable to be used. And what they want to do is harmonize it so that if they say it's okay, then it's okay for every other nation to say it's okay. It's not mandating it, and this is where everybody gets a little confused. They're not forcing nations to do anything. They're enabling nations to take the easy path. Oh, well, the WHO pre-qualified it for emergency use, so our nation will require it. And I exposed this all the way back, 2 years ago. I found a document from, this might not mean anything to you and the UK audience, but the date that it was put into the Federal Register in the United States was January 19th, 2017. There were a lot of changes made. It was a final ruling by the Center for CDC. And what they did, amongst many other things, was make it so that the only thing our health minister needed to declare a public health emergency in the United States was to reference the fact that the Director General had declared a public health emergency of international concern. So it's not a mandate coming down from the WHO. It is an enabling act in our regulations that gives our officials regulatory cover to just do whatever the heck they want to do. If Tedros said so, then Javier Becerra can say so, then your governor, your health minister in your state and county and city. It's this cascade of passing the buck. Well, he said so, and he said so because he said so, and he said so because Tedros said so, but there's no facts needed at the point, the top of the pyramid there. Now, that was proposed by the by the Obama administration on the last full day of their term in office. The next day, Trump was inaugurated as president. So those types of local problems with laws that slip in and people don't understand. I want to give a shout out to a friend, Catherine Watt. We got to get you guys together because she's awesome. Catherine published about a week or so ago a wonderful Substack on bailiwicknews.substack.com about each state, each nation, each jurisdiction everywhere really doesn't need to tell the WHO to go take a hike. That's all fine and dandy. What we need to do is the hard work of analyzing our emergency protocol legislation and how, all of the healthcare rules are governed. A lot of laws need to be repealed and new ones need to be written in their place to protect we the people from corrupt legislation that has made it so that criminal activity is actually built into the law. That is a lot of work, and we need to do it. It's not going to be solved by just saying, oh, the WHO needs to go away. Yes, it does, but I'll maybe try to wrap it up with one sentence. Over the last 4.5 years, your local tyrants did not need any amendments to the international health regulations, and they did not need any new pandemic treaty to abuse your rights and freedoms. They could probably teach the WHO a thing or two about how to abuse people. And so we need to act locally to bring that back under our control. The amendments in many ways are not what they were. And we still don't have a concrete answer about what they are, because they're going to have another meeting April 22nd to the 26th. That's supposed to be their final meeting to negotiate it. We need to stop it. Okay, they were supposed to be done in December and presented in January. They do not get to break their own rules and try to pull a Nancy Pelosi and drop it down on the table at the last minute and say, you can see it after you pass it. That is not acceptable because it's intimately tied with the treaty documents, right? They reference each other a little bit. And so the next meeting, last meeting for that is April 22nd to the 26th. And then the 2 weeks following that, April 29th to May 10th, are the meetings for the pandemic treaty. Now, that's interesting because the last meeting that they had at the end of March was supposed to be their final, they were supposed to be clinking the champagne glasses and be done. But they bumped into a little bit of a speed bump. They started with a 29-page document, and they got 5,000 text edits from the various nations. It ballooned up to a 110-page document. They're currently rewriting it. The new version is due to make the private rounds by the 18th of April. And then they're meeting to have their final meeting April 29th to May 10th. And all I can say is, why in the world would we want the WHO to be in charge of the research, development, seeking out, searching for pathogens with pandemic potential to bring, into a pathogen access and benefit sharing system to make money off of pathogens that weren't necessarily bothering anybody, put it into their global distribution network to proliferate biological weapons. We already have the United States Defense Department doing that. Do you really need it to be redundantly done? The U.S. pledged $5 billion to the pandemic fund, and they passed out $340 million in 2023 to 37 different nations to build out laboratories and genetic sequencing and so forth and so on. What we have to understand is this is biological warfare. This is looking for pathogens to scare people with so that they can profit from it. And if they're successful in convincing people to stick it in their arm, we're talking, just an absolute Armageddon of disease, which feeds their business model. They don't necessarily want to
And they
kill
could
you.
find a really they could find a really effective pathogen as well, which is another frightening possibility.
It's the business model is not to heal people or even better, help them optimize and maintain their health. There's no money in that. These are all customer acquisition tools. If they can trick you with a test, if they can get you to take a poison that they call a drug, if they can get you to inject a poison to prevent something that you don't have, but it's right on the horizon, disease X is out there, be afraid, they're just acquiring permanent lifetime customers. If they kill you too quickly, they don't make as much money. That's a little bit of a problem. And, so the funeral directors are finding all of the, white stringy clots and all of the, spike protein. If people would just understand that the business model does not really benefit by helping you stay healthy. They benefit by helping you stay ill. And if you're currently healthy and they can convince you to do something that harms your health under the guise of preventing something that you don't have, they've just acquired yet another customer. Don't be customers of the pharmaceutical hospital emergency industrial complex. Learn how to stay healthy, do the things that make sense to you, and realize that this is not about your health. These negotiated agreements are primarily an attempt to steal from poor people in rich nations in the global north by taxes or debt to transfer that money to wealthy people in poor nations, not to help the poor people, but to help the profitability of those who want to be engaged in this business sector. I got a clue about all of this back in November of 2022 when the Indonesian health minister was talking to the business leaders, and he said two separate things. One of them was they were proud that they could keep the economy going if people would get properly tested and properly jabbed. Well, my first response was, that's a lie right there. There is no proper jab and proper test. Then he went on to say that it would be a great business opportunity for the business leaders there to invest in health. And this was a month before Congress passed the National Defense Authorization Act to set up the pandemic fund with the World Bank. And the U.S. pledged $5 billion over the next 5 years to start building out this laboratory network to do all of the things that we're talking about. And I think that the WHO has fund envy. They want a bigger, better, stronger fund so that they can get into the biological weapons proliferation business. Seems to be quite profitable.
James, a lot first to think about there. I think we'll just leave it there for now. There is more we could talk about, so we'll probably talk again fairly soon. But I really like this idea that we should be treating the fundamental cause, not the symptoms. And I don't want a transfer of funds from poor people in our countries to rich people in countries that are otherwise poor. And we do know that corruption is a big problem in the world. But you've done a lot to highlight it. And we've said in the past that you have the role of a watchman. You're warning against the sword coming against the city. So you've done your duty very thoroughly. The blood is not on your head. it's on people that may choose to ignore the warning that you've given.
To try to make it
So,
very, very simple, okay? We, the people across the world, simply have to be aware of what it is they're doing, be clear, demand to see, what is really going on, not the tricks that they're trying to get us to be distracted with. And the simple answer is no. No to the amendments, no to the treaty, because it's predicated on absolutely false assumptions. If you want to have a little fun with it, you can ask, a public official, was it the N or the O that you were having difficulty understanding? The answer is no. And so I've put together an awful lot of information from people around the world. You can go to exitthewho.org. And you can also go to just plain old jamesroguski.substack.com. Click on the archive, and everything is there. I don't put anything behind a paywall.
we'll put the links to those, James. Yeah.
And I encourage people to give me a call. You can call me. I'm in California. You might text me or use Signal or Telegram or WhatsApp or whatever. 310-619-3055. But most importantly, share the daylights out of this video so people see the whole picture. But then take out your phone, take out your camera. I encourage people to videotape any, document that they've read coming from the WHO so that they cannot accuse you of misinformation. Take anything you want, videotape it, and then express your opinion. Because if you're silent, they will accept your silence as consent. And so I participated in a listening session with our Office of Global Affairs just this morning. And they got an earful from quite a number of people who essentially said, look, this is completely invalid. You missed your deadlines. You lied. You committed fraud in 2022. We're on to you. We see what you're attempting to do. And even if you pretend again to adopt something in May, we're not having it. It's illegitimate. It will not be accepted. You will not be taking our money to, line your pockets in order to make products that harm people. You're either out of your mind or you're evil. And it stops here. This will not be allowed to happen, period.
Absolutely. James, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, John, and thank you for all that you do.
And I understand the philosophy much better now, so that's actually really useful. And thank you, James.
Thank you.